The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Mei Lin had decided she was done waiting. She had been sitting at the small wooden desk in the corner of her apartment in Chengdu, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside her window, when her mother called for the fourth time that week. Mei Lin already knew what the conversation would be before she answered. Her mother's voice carried that particular blend of love and urgency that only Chinese mothers seemed capable of producing, a sound that was equal parts warmth and pressure, like being wrapped in a blanket that was slightly too tight. "There is a program," her mother said without preamble. "Your Auntie Chen's neighbor's daughter used it. She is very happy now, in Montana. She has a big house and horses." Mei Lin had closed her eyes. She was 31 years old. She had an accounting degree and a job at a mid-sized firm that she was quite good at. She had friends, though most of them were married now, their social media profiles slowly filling with photographs of children in matching outfits. She was not unhappy, exactly, but she was tired of the particular loneliness that had settled into her life like furniture nobody had chosen on purpose. Just things that accumulated until you couldn't remember what the room looked like before. "Send me the information," she said, and her mother made a sound like someone had just told her she'd won something. The program was called Western Hearts International Exchange. It was not, Mei Lin discovered after reading through the entire website with the focused attention she brought to quarterly reports, particularly romantic in its description. It was essentially a matching program designed to connect women from China, Vietnam, South Korea, and the Philippines with men from rural America who had, for various geographic and economic reasons, found it difficult to meet potential partners through conventional means. The website was careful to frame everything in terms of cultural exchange and mutual benefit. There were testimonials from couples who looked genuinely happy in their photographs. There was a section on legal requirements and visa processes. There was a FAQ page that answered, with admirable directness, every question Mei Lin might have had about the mechanics of the whole arrangement. She filled out the application at midnight, after 2 glasses of wine, which she would later think of as either the best or worst decision she'd ever made while slightly tipsy. 6 weeks later, she was on a video call with a program coordinator named Sandra, a brisk woman in her 50s with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her head, who explained that Mei Lin had been matched with several potential candidates, and would she like to review their profiles. The profiles were, in Sandra's words, honest. What she meant was that the men had written their own descriptions without much coaching, and the results ranged from endearing to bewildering. One man had listed his hobbies as working, eating, and not talking much. Another had included a photograph of himself with a large fish, and seemed to consider this sufficient biographical information. A third had written a paragraph about the importance of a woman who could handle cold winters, which Mei Lin found oddly specific. And then there was Caleb Marsh. His profile was short. He was 34 years old. He ran a cattle ranch in a place called Heron Creek, Montana. He had taken over the ranch from his father, who had died 3 years prior. He had one photograph, in which he was standing next to a fence post wearing a canvas jacket, squinting slightly against what appeared to be a bright afternoon sun. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that looked like it spent most of its time outdoors. He had written exactly 2 sentences in the personal description field. "I am better at taking care of things than I am at talking about myself. I would like someone to share meals with and to build something alongside." Mei Lin read those 2 sentences 4 times. She told Sandra she was interested in Caleb Marsh. There followed 3 months of correspondence that began formally and grew gradually less so. They communicated primarily through email because the time difference made phone calls complicated, and also because Mei Lin suspected that Caleb, who had confirmed in his first message that he was indeed not much of a talker, found written communication easier to manage at his own pace. His emails were short at first, careful in the way of someone who is choosing each word with deliberate consideration, like he was worried about saying something wrong. He asked her questions about her work, about Chengdu, about what she liked to eat. He answered her questions about the ranch with more detail than she expected. She had asked once what a typical morning looked like, and he had written 2 full paragraphs about the particular quality of the light at 5 in the morning in winter, the way the cold settled differently depending on whether snow was coming, the sounds the cattle made when they were content versus when something was wrong. She began to look forward to his emails in the way she hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. In November, Sandra explained the next phase of the program. A gathering was held twice a year in Billings, Montana, where the matched women would meet their potential partners in person for the first time, in a structured setting with program coordinators present to facilitate. The women were flown in, accommodated in a hotel, and the event itself took place over a weekend, with organized activities and time for individual conversations. If things went well, further visits could be arranged. If both parties wished to proceed toward marriage, the legal and immigration processes would begin. Mei Lin bought a plane ticket. She told her mother, who wept with a happiness that Mei Lin found both touching and slightly alarming. She packed a suitcase with the careful attention of someone preparing for an expedition into unknown territory, which was, she supposed, not entirely inaccurate. She had never been to America. She had never been further west than Beijing. The flight took 14 hours, with a connection in Seattle. By the time she landed in Billings, Mei Lin had been traveling for almost 20 hours, and her body had entirely lost track of what time or day it was supposed to be. Sandra met her at the arrivals area with 4 other women, all of them carrying the same slightly dazed expression of people who had crossed too many time zones in too short a time. There was a woman named Yun from Guangzhou and Priya from Ho Chi Minh City, and 2 women named Jina and Su, Yon from Seoul, both of whom knew each other slightly from going through the program at the same time and had bonded over this on the flight from Seattle. The hotel was comfortable and clean. Sandra gave them the evening to rest and adjust, and they ate dinner together in the hotel restaurant, the 5 of them and Sandra and 2 other coordinators, and Mei Lin found herself relaxing slightly into the company of these women who were all, in their various ways, doing the same improbable and brave and perhaps slightly reckless thing that she was doing. That night, lying in a hotel bed in Montana, with the darkness outside the window absolute in the way that city darkness never was, Mei Lin thought about Caleb's emails. She thought about the line he had written in one of his later messages, when their correspondence had grown more personal. "I should tell you that I am quiet in person, quieter than I am in writing. Even, some people find that difficult." She had written back that she had grown up in a household where her mother talked enough for everyone, and she had come to appreciate the value of someone who didn't feel the need to fill silence. She hoped he would be there tomorrow. She hoped he would not be disappointed when he saw her in person. She hoped she would not be disappointed when she saw him. She was not sure which of these possibilities frightened her more. The event was held in a conference space on the 2nd floor of the hotel that the coordinators had done their best to make less conference room-like, with round tables and flowers and what appeared to be an attempt at tasteful decorations. When Mei Lin arrived with the other women at 10 in the morning, there were perhaps 20 men already in the room, gathered in small groups or standing near the coffee station, most of them wearing what she could tell was their nicest version of casual pressed shirts, clean boots, hair that had been combed with unusual thoroughness. Sandra had explained the format. The morning would be a general gathering, mingling, an opportunity for people to find their matches and talk in a low-stakes environment. There would be a catered lunch. The afternoon would have more structured time for individual conversations. Nothing was required to proceed beyond this weekend. This was simply a first meeting. Mei Lin walked into the room and felt, immediately and without warning, a spike of pure social terror that she had not anticipated. She was a competent woman. She gave presentations at work. She had traveled alone to a foreign country. But something about the specific nature of this moment, the knowledge that she was here to be seen, to be evaluated, to perhaps be chosen or not chosen, hit her in the chest like a closed fist. She saw several of the men look up when the women entered. She saw some faces shift with recognition, with the slight excitement of someone seeing for the first time the person they'd been writing to. She saw Jinnah immediately cross the room toward a broad-shouldered man who lit up when he saw her, and she felt a pang of something that she recognized, after a moment, as envy. She looked for Caleb. She didn't see him. The morning passed in a way that Mei Lin would later remember as a series of slightly blurred impressions. She talked to several men, one of whom was from the original batch of profiles she'd reviewed, and who was perfectly pleasant and seemed genuinely interested in speaking with her. She drank 2 cups of coffee she didn't need. She watched the room with the focused attention of someone trying to map a space they'd never been in before. She watched other pairs find each other, watched some conversations go well and some go awkwardly, watched Sandra moving through the room like a careful shepherd. Caleb was not there. By 11:30, she had begun to construct, with the systematic thoroughness of an accountant, all of the possible explanations for his absence. He had changed his mind. Something had happened at the ranch. He had decided, having thought it over more carefully, that this entire endeavor was not something he wanted after all. He had looked at her photograph and found some reason that she could not quite bring herself to define clearly, even in her own thoughts. She did not let herself show any of this. She smiled. She talked. She answered a question about Chengdu from a man named Dale, who had the easy friendliness of someone who had probably never experienced a moment of genuine social anxiety in his entire life. At noon, Sandra called everyone to the tables for lunch. Mei Lin found a seat next to Su Yon, who leaned over and whispered that her match was very nice, but she wasn't sure she could live somewhere that cold. And Mei Lin laughed despite everything, because it was exactly the right kind of ordinary human concern to pull her back from the edge of her own spiraling thoughts. She was 3 bites into a plate of food she couldn't have described afterward when she heard a slight commotion near the door. Not loud, just a shift in the air of the room, a few heads turning. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, still in his jacket, holding a hat in both hands the way someone holds something they're not sure what to do with. He was taller than she'd expected, and the photograph had not quite captured the particular quality of his stillness. He held himself the way people who spend a lot of time in open spaces sometimes did, as though he'd learned to take up exactly the amount of room he needed, and no more. His eyes moved through the room in the unhurried way of someone who was looking for something specific, and was going to find it without rushing. His eyes found her. Mei Lin watched something cross his face that she could not entirely read, but which looked, she thought, like relief. Sandra materialized at his elbow with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated many of these moments. "Caleb, you made it. We were beginning to—" "Sorry," he said. "Truck had a problem outside Laurel. Took a while to sort out." His voice was exactly what she would have expected from his emails. Low, measured, not hurried. Sandra said something that Mei Lin didn't catch because Caleb was already crossing the room toward her, and she stood up from the table, and for a moment they were just looking at each other across about 6 feet of carpet, with the strange and particular intensity of people who know a lot about each other in some ways and almost nothing in others. "Mei Lin," he said, not a question. "Caleb," she said. He put out his hand and she shook it, and it was a very ordinary thing that somehow made everything feel more real than it had in months. He sat down next to her, and they talked through the rest of lunch, and she noticed several things about him that the emails had not been able to convey. The way he listened with his whole attention. The way he didn't fill silences just to fill them. The way he occasionally said something that was quietly funny in a way that made her want to laugh before she'd even processed the joke. He asked her about the flight, and she told him about the connection in Seattle, and he said he'd been to Seattle once in his life and had found it very wet, and she said that Chengdu was also very wet, and he said that was something they had in common, and they were both quiet for a moment after that, with the particular quality of a silence that is full rather than empty. The afternoon had more structured time, as Sandra had promised, and Mei Lin and Caleb ended up in 2 chairs near a window that looked out at the parking lot, and beyond it, the particular pale, gold, openness of Montana in November. He told her about the ranch in a way that was different from the emails, more concrete, more specific about the problems and the difficulties, the 3 years since his father died that had been hard in ways he was still sorting through. She told him about her mother, and the apartment in Chengdu, and the particular loneliness of being 31 and watching everyone around you pair off while you remained stubbornly yourself in your own life. "I thought you might not come," she said, and regretted it as soon as it was out of her mouth, because it was too direct, too revealing, not how she typically spoke to people she had known for a matter of hours. He looked at her steadily. "I said I'd be here," he said, as if this were entirely sufficient, as if a thing said was a thing that simply happened because it had been said. She found this, against all expectation, enormously reassuring. Later, in the group portion of the afternoon, Sandra organized a brief activity that involved each person saying something they were hoping for. Not specifically about this process, she clarified. Just in general, something they wanted for their lives. It was the kind of exercise that Mei Lin would normally have found slightly cringe-inducing, but the mood in the room had shifted over the course of the day, and it landed differently than she expected. When it came around to her, she said, "I want to build something. I've spent a long time maintaining things, managing things. I want to make something that grows." She didn't look at Caleb when she said it, but she could feel him looking at her. When it came to him, there was a pause. The room was quiet in the way it gets when someone is gathering themselves, same as what she said. He said, simple, without elaboration. Several people smiled. Mei Lin looked down at her hands. The weekend passed. On Sunday morning, Sandra met individually with each pair to check in about whether they wanted to continue to the next stage. Further visits, more time to consider. Every pair said yes. Mei Lin said yes. Caleb said yes, and then said, looking at his hat which he was once again holding in both hands, "I'd like to show you the ranch, if you'd be willing, before anything is decided. I think you should see what you'd be saying yes to." She thought this was, possibly, one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to her. She came back to Montana in February, in winter that was serious in a way that Chengdu winters never were, cold that had actual weight to it, cold that meant something. Caleb picked her up from the airport in a truck that was larger than any vehicle she had ever ridden in, and they drove 2 hours south through a landscape that was the most purely itself of any landscape she had ever seen, undecorated, enormous, sky that went on until it became a philosophical concept. The ranch was in a valley between hills that were white with snow, the house itself modest and practical, the outbuildings in good repair, everything with the particular quality of being, well, maintained not for appearances, but because things that aren't maintained stop working. He showed her everything without apology or salesmanship. The barn with its smell of hay and animals, the frozen creek that ran along the east edge of the property, the room that had been his father's office and was now, still, half his father's office because he hadn't quite figured out what to do with it. She met his neighbor, a woman named Ruth, who drove over on the second day and made coffee and talked to Mei Lin for 45 minutes about nothing in particular in the way of people who have decided they like you and are simply spending time with you. Before she left, Ruth said to Caleb, within Mei Lin's hearing, "She's got a good head." And Caleb said, "I know." And Ruth drove away in a truck as large as Caleb's. On the third evening, they were sitting on the porch in the cold. Mei Lin had, at Caleb's suggestion, borrowed his largest jacket, which reached nearly to her knees, watching the darkness settle into the valley, and she said, "Can I ask you something that might be too direct?" "Go ahead," he said. "Why did you use this program? You don't seem like someone who would have difficulty meeting people." He was quiet for a moment in his particular way, which she had learned by now was not evasion, but simply that he thought before he spoke. "I have difficulty meeting the right kind of people," he said. "The women around here, the ones I know, they have their lives built. They're not looking for what I have to offer, which is a lot of work and a lot of quiet. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's just not what they want. And I was told there were women who were looking for something more." He paused, seemed to find the word distasteful in a particular way. "Substantial," he said. "That's the word Sandra used. I'm not sure I'd have chosen it. What word would you choose?" He considered. "Real," he said. "I think I was looking for someone who wanted something real." Mei Lin thought about her apartment in Chengdu, about the evenings alone, about the specific way loneliness has of becoming a kind of company if you let it stay long enough. "I think that's what I wanted too," she said. The process that followed was not quick or simple. There were legal requirements, forms, waiting periods, more forms. Sandra walked them through it with her characteristic efficient compassion. Mei Lin returned to Chengdu and put in her notice at work, which her boss took with a complicated expression that contained both genuine goodwill and the slight resentment of someone losing a competent employee to circumstances they couldn't argue with. Her mother came over that night and cried for an hour, a mixture of joy and grief that Mei Lin found entirely understandable and held through without trying to fix. She sold most of her furniture. She kept her books and her good kitchen knife and the small painted wooden figure of a tiger that had sat on her desk since she was a child, a gift from a grandfather who died when she was 8, and whose face she could no longer quite remember, but whose hands she remembered exactly. She flew back to Montana in June, this time on a different kind of ticket. The wedding was small. Ruth and her husband attended, and a few of Caleb's friends from town, and Sandra, who cried in a way that suggested she had been to enough of these to know which ones were going to work out. Mei Lin's mother watched on a video call from Chengdu, her face filling the laptop screen that Caleb's friend had propped on a chair, and at the end she said in Mandarin that she was happy, and Caleb said, haltingly, using the phrase Mei Lin had taught him in the preceding weeks, that he would take good care of her daughter, and her mother made the sound of someone who has just received exactly what they wanted. The first year was not without difficulty, which neither of them had expected it to be. There was the ordinary difficulty of two people learning to share space, the negotiations of habit and preference that are necessary and sometimes arduous. There was Mei Lin's isolation in the first months, before she had made connections in town, before her English had expanded to the full register of casual conversation, before she knew the roads and the distances, and the particular rhythms of rural Montana life. There were days that were hard and evenings that were quiet in a way that tipped, occasionally, from peace into loneliness. But there were also other things. There was the particular pleasure of feeding livestock in the morning, which Mei Lin had not anticipated finding satisfying, but which she did. The specific transaction of care and need, the warmth of the animals in the cold air, the orderliness of the routine. There was the kitchen, which became, with time and effort and several notable failed experiments, the place in the house that was most completely hers, not replacing what had been there before, but adding to it, the smells of Sichuan cooking mingling with whatever Caleb had grown up eating until the house smelled like somewhere new. There was the silence, which she had promised herself she would find manageable, and which turned out to be, on most days, genuinely beautiful. The silence of a place that isn't quiet because nothing is happening, but quiet because everything has enough room. And there was Caleb himself, who was exactly what his emails and his presence had promised. A man who paid attention, who kept his word, who did not confuse not saying a thing for not feeling it. She learned to read him in the way you learn to read landscapes that don't announce their features, the subtle shifts that told her when he was worried about the cattle, or the finances, or the coming winter, the quality of his attention when he was content. He learned to read her in return, learned the difference between her silences, learned when she needed company and when she needed to be left alone with her thoughts, which was also sometimes a form of company. 2 years in, she called her mother from the porch on a summer evening while Caleb was in the barn, and her mother asked how things were, genuinely and not just ritually, and Mei Lin looked out at the valley in the long summer light and said, "Good, Mama, things are genuinely good." Her mother said, I knew from the beginning." Mei Lin smiled. "You knew nothing. You sent me a link from Auntie Chen's neighbor. And it worked." Her mother said, with the absolute serenity of someone who has decided this makes her prescient. Caleb came out of the barn and walked toward the house, and she lifted her hand, and he lifted his, and they held the gaze for a moment in the fading light before she looked back at the valley and continued talking to her mother, and the ordinary evening settled around the house like something earned. She had been terrified, in that hotel conference room, watching the door, not seeing his face. She had constructed all the possible reasons for his absence, all the ways this might mean what she feared it meant, that she was someone who would not be chosen, that she had come all this way, across all those miles and years, to find herself still on the outside of something she wanted. She had felt, in those hours, all the accumulated weight of every time she had been 30, one and alone, and watching other people's happiness through the particular glass of her own life. And then he had walked in the door, and she had looked at him, and he had looked at her, and the relief on his face had been the same thing she felt. Nobody had picked her, and nobody had picked him, and they had found each other at the end of a long, strange, improbable road, and he had raised his hand, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but in the quiet and steady way of a man who had decided something and was not the type to decide and then do nothing about it. Mine, not as ownership, as belonging, as the recognition of a thing that is true. The ranch in Heron Creek grew. Not dramatically, not in ways that would make news, but in the way that things grow when they are cared for consistently. More fencing repaired than broken, more calves born healthy, more evenings on the porch watching the light change over the hills. Mei Lin started keeping bees in the second year, a project that had begun as curiosity and become, over time, a genuine passion. She read everything she could find about it, ordered books, watched videos, drove 2 hours to talk to an old beekeeper outside Billings, who turned out to speak no Mandarin and very little patience, but knew everything there was to know about bees in Montana winters. The honey she produced became, by the third year, something she sold at the farmer's market in town, where she was known, simply and without exoticism, as May, who had the good honey. She called it Heron Creek honey, and the label showed a simple ink drawing of a creek and a bee that Caleb had drawn himself, awkwardly and with great concentration, one evening at the kitchen table. She had laughed when she saw it. "You're a terrible artist," she said. "I know," he said, without offense. "But it looks like a bee." "Barely," she said. "Barely is enough for a label," he said. She used the label. Her mother came to visit in the third autumn, flying for the first time in her 70 years, arriving at the Billings airport with 2 large suitcases and a third bag entirely filled with things. She had decided Mei Lin could not live without dried mushrooms, a specific variety of chili paste, tea from a particular shop in Chengdu, a package of items for the kitchen that suggested her mother had significant concerns about the adequacy of Montana cuisine. She stayed for 3 weeks. She and Caleb communicated primarily through Mei Lin's translations and a shared language of food and gesture, her mother cooking in the kitchen with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. Caleb eating everything she put in front of him with the honest appetite of a man who genuinely enjoyed a meal. On her last evening, Mei Lin's mother sat with Caleb on the porch after dinner, while Mei Lin washed dishes and watched them through the window. They sat in companionable silence, her mother looking at the hills in the darkness, Caleb with his coffee. She could not hear what was said, if anything was said. But at one point her mother reached over and patted Caleb's arm twice, in the particular way she had, deliberate, meaningful, the gesture of someone conferring something. When Mei Lin came out, her mother said only, "He is a good man. He doesn't say much, but he means what he says. These are the ones to keep." Mei Lin looked at Caleb, who looked back at her with that particular expression she had learned to read as warmth without performance. "I know, Mama," she said. "I know." The years settled into themselves in the way that good years do, not uniformly easy, not without their shadows, but with a quality of accumulation that felt like the right kind of weight, the weight of things being built rather than things being endured. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the grinding anxiety of cattle prices dropping in a year when equipment needed replacing. There was the year Caleb's knee required surgery, and he was off his feet for 6 weeks, and she ran the daily operations of the ranch with a combination of her own learning and Ruth's ruthless, practical help, and when it was over and he was back on his feet, he said simply, "I don't know what I would have done." And she said, "You don't need to know, because you didn't have to." And something in the room settled more permanently into place. There was, in the 5th year, a daughter. She was born in April, which Mei Lin had been told was the best time in Montana, when the worst of winter has conceded and the light returns in a way that feels earned. They named her Anna Chosen because it worked in both Mandarin and English, because it was clean and clear and could belong anywhere. Mei Lin's mother reached on the phone within minutes of the birth, wept again, and this time the joy was uncomplicated. Caleb held Anna in the hospital room with the careful intensity of a man who has spent years handling things that are both valuable and fragile, and understands the weight of that responsibility. Mei Lin watched his face while he did this and thought that she could trace the whole strange journey backward from this moment. The letter, the application, the hotel conference room, the door where she had waited without knowing she was waiting, the man walking in holding his hat in both hands, and every step of it, every anxious and improbable mile of it, arrived exactly here, at this particular moment in this particular room, which was as real and as substantial as anything she had ever experienced. He looked up and found her watching him. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. Outside the window, Montana was the color of a beginning.